From the 1940s to the 1970s, the traditional British sports car, open-topped and low-slung with a low-capacity engine, but a weight light enough to make it perky in performance, dominated the world, presenting to the buying public the nippy handling and experience of larger sports cars, but for prices that were within the reach of average people, and for that it would become a global phenomenon respected on all markets. Sadly, the traditional British sports car, like many trends in the automotive industry, would face a slow and painful decline as technology advanced, and by the 1970s the very concept that had underpinned the genre had been rendered obsolete by the march of better mechanical fidelity and the rise of machines with superior practicality and equal performance in the form of the hot hatchbacks, and by 1980 nearly all examples of the type had been rendered extinct. The story begins during the interwar years, when during an age when motoring itself was still a relatively new and sometimes precarious pursuit, Britain's engineers and enthusiasts alike began to define a uniquely national approach to performance driving. As while continental Europe produced exotic and expensive machinery intended for a privileged elite, these cars were beautifully crafted but prohibitively costly. With marques such as Bugatti, Alfa Romeo and Delage making a name for themselves at the top of the market, Britain's motor industry took a different path altogether, one rooted in pragmatism, resourcefulness, and the belief that enjoyment behind the wheel need not be reserved for the wealthy few. And in the early 1920s, a handful of small British manufacturers saw an opportunity to build vehicles that offered genuine sporting performance for the ordinary motoring enthusiast. Firms such as Riley, Alvis and Singer were among the earliest to seize upon this shift in public sentiment, producing nimble, cleverly engineered machines that could be driven to work during the week and then, with minimal preparation, taken to the track at the weekends, where they competed with surprising success against larger, more powerful opposition, thus blurring the line between road and race, and thereby encouraging a new breed of amateur competition driver and cultivating a culture of mechanical understanding and self-reliance. It was in this vibrant and experimental environment that Cecil Kimber, the enterprising manager of Morris Garages in Oxford, took a modest Morris chassis and clothed it in a rakish, low-slung body of his own design, with the result, introduced in 1923, being the first MG sports car, the beginning of a legend that would come to symbolize Britain's entire sporting motoring ethos. Kimber's little cars were simple, honest and charmingly direct, and in their own unpretentious way, they defined what a British sports car ought to be, being open to the elements, mechanically straightforward, compact yet purposeful, and lively enough to make every journey an adventure, with the appeal lying not in sheer speed, but in the immediacy of the experience, including the rasp of the engine, the wind in one's face, and the sense of communion between driver, machine and road. By the 1930s, this formula had found wide and enduring appeal, and MG, now joined by other marques such as Morgan, Triumph, AC, Sunbeam, and the fledgling SS, which would later evolve into Jaguar, began to refine the idea of the small British roadster, with these companies drawing on the nation's long tradition of craftsmanship, competition and engineering innovation to produce cars that were far more than the sum of their modest parts. Racing, too, played an essential role in shaping the identity of the British sports car, with the interwar years seeing an explosion of amateur competition, from the high-speed bankings of Brooklands to the twisting lanes of the RAC Rally and the great endurance trials of the continent, with British models, often privately entered and painstakingly tuned by enthusiastic owners, developing a reputation for punching well above their weight. MGs, Rileys and Singers performed valiantly in international competition, including at Le Mans, in Emilia-Romagna, and on countless hill climbs, and sometimes even bested far more expensive machinery from Europe's grand marques, with their successes on the track and the rally stage feeding directly into sales on the road, imbuing the public with a sense of pride in British engineering, and fueling a culture of participation that would endure long after the checkered flag had fallen. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 brought an abrupt end to this flowering of automotive creativity, with production lines being repurposed for the war effort. Yet even as the industry was transformed by necessity, the idea of the British sports car endured in the national consciousness, with many Allied servicemen stationed in the UK, particularly Americans, becoming acquainted with these dashing little roadsters. To men accustomed to large, softly sprung American automobiles, the small, agile British sports car was a revelation, being intimate, responsive and thrillingly alive, and when the war ended and these men returned home, they carried with them an enduring affection for the cars they had encountered on English roads and airfields, unknowingly laying the groundwork for a post-war export boom that would transform Britain's motor industry and cement its reputation as the world's foremost producer of affordable sporting cars. With the end of the war in 1945, the government's now famous Export or Die directive urged manufacturers to find markets abroad in order to settle the wartime debts, and MG was the first to seize the opportunity, as within months of the war's end, the company reintroduced its small sports car, the MGTC, which was essentially a slightly modernized version of its pre-war model, the TA. With its upright radiator, narrow track, cycle wings, spindly wire wheels, and right-hand drive layout, the TC was technically old-fashioned, yet its charm was undeniable, and while fewer than 10,000 examples were built between 1945 and 1949, almost all were exported to North America, where they found a ready audience among ex-servicemen and young professionals craving something affordable and exciting. The TC's willing 1,250cc engine, precise steering, and engaging road banners made it an instant hit, and its success sparked a wave of imitators, with the TD and TF that followed refining the formula with improved suspension, hydraulic brakes, and more comfort, broadening the appeal still further. And by the mid-1950s, MG was exporting tens of thousands of cars annually, establishing itself as the largest producer of sports cars in the world, encouraged further by its $2,000 retail price in America, which was half that of a new Corvette. Other manufacturers could not fail to notice, and in 1948, Jaguar unveiled the XK120, a car that stunned the motoring world with its sensuous curves and astonishing performance, while its twin-cam straight-six engine, derived from racing development, propelled it to a verified 120 miles an hour, making it the fastest production car in existence at the time, with the XK120's combination of power, refinement, and beauty, establishing Jaguar as a world-class marque and set the tone for the company's future victories at Le Mans with the C and D-type racers. Around the same time, Aston Martin, revived under the stewardship of David Brown, returned to prominence with a new generation of refined Grand Tourers, culminating in the DB2 and later the DB4 and DB5, machines that would come to define British motoring sophistication, while the early 1950s would see Triumph join the fray with the TR2, an honest, rugged roadster capable of 100 miles an hour, but priced within the reach of the middle class. This was swiftly followed by the TR3, TR4, and later TR6, each one improving on the last while maintaining the raw mechanical feel that enthusiasts adored, while Healey, a talented engineer and racing driver, forged a partnership with Austin to produce the Austin-Healey 100 in 1953, a muscular and strikingly styled car that combined robust Austin mechanicals with Healey's racing expertise, while the later Austin-Healey 3000 model became a genuine transatlantic favorite. Across the pond, America embraced these cars with open arms, and by 1956, over half of all British-built automobiles were exported, and roughly 80% of MG, Triumph, and Healey production went straight to the United States, with MG alone selling more than 100,000 cars during the decade, while the TR series and Austin-Healeys added tens of thousands more, with Britain's small sports cars becoming cultural symbols, seen in Hollywood films, parked outside suburban homes, and raced at countless weekend events across the country. The 1960s were the undisputed peak of British dominance in the world of sports cars, a golden decade when small workshops and large factories alike seemed united in producing machines that embodied style, speed, and mechanical purity, with Jaguar's E-Type unveiled at the Geneva Motor Show in 1961, stunning the world's motoring press and public alike with its aircraft-inspired monocoque construction, 3.8-litre straight-six engine derived from Jaguar's Le Mans-winning D-Type, at a price less than half that of a Ferrari. Meanwhile, in a different corner of Britain's motoring landscape, Lotus, under the brilliant and uncompromising Colin Chapman, was perfecting the art of lightness and engineering purity, with the Lotus Elan, introduced in 1962, being a revelation, with its ingenious steel backbone chassis and fiberglass body, allowing for a car that weighed barely 700 kilograms, yet handled with a precision that astonished even seasoned drivers. At the opposite end of the market, Aston Martin carried the banner for British sophistication and muscular refinement, with the DB4 and DB5 combining handcrafted elegance with racing-bred performance, and their straight-six engines provided effortless pace wrapped in bodies of timeless beauty, with the DB5, immortalized by James Bond in Goldfinger, transcending its mechanical reality to become a global cultural symbol. Further down the price ladder, cars like the Triumph Spitfire, the Austin-Healey Sprite, and the MG Midget made the dream of sports car ownership accessible to thousands, and in 1966, a brand new Spitfire could be bought in the United States for under $2,500, but offered an entirely different kind of thrill, being light, nimble, and charmingly simple, a car designed for winding roads and open skies rather than straight-line speed. Sales figures during this extraordinary decade reflected just how far British sports cars had spread their influence, with MG selling around 200,000 MGBs between 1962 and 1969 alone, and the model would go on to exceed 500,000 units before production finally ceased, while Triumph produced more than 90,000 TR4s and TR5s in the same period, and Austin-Healey exported over 80% of its 3000 models to North America, and by the middle of the decade, Britain accounted for more than half of all sports cars sold in the United States. However, as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the first cracks in Britain's post-war motoring dominance began to show, with the American market, which had long underpinned the success and profitability of the British sports car sector, beginning to shift in ways that few in Coventry, Abingdon or Canley could have anticipated, with safety and emissions regulations introduced after 1968, forcing manufacturers to make significant modifications to their cars in order to remain compliant. Lacking the vast financial and technical resources of their American, German, or Japanese rivals, British firms resorted to the cheapest and most expedient solutions possible, with bumpers raised and fitted with thick rubber overriders to meet the newest impact standards, while ungainly side marker lights were attached to once graceful bodywork and carburetors were retuned or restricted to satisfy tightening emissions tests. Perhaps the most prominent example of this compliance was the 1974 MGB, which was saddled with unsightly black rubber bumpers and a detuned engine that reduced power from around 95 to 62 horsepower, turning what had once been a nimble, eager sports car into a sluggish mundanity, while the Triumph Spitfire endured a similar fate, with its simple charm dulled by emission-strangled engines and heavier construction. By 1975, British Leyland, burdened by industrial strife and collapsing finances, kept long-standing models alive far beyond their natural lifespans, with little more than cosmetic changes to disguise aging designs, with the MGB still being produced nearly 20 years after its introduction in 1962, with its essential architecture virtually unchanged, despite the shifting expectations of the marketplace. Triumph's wedge-shaped TR7 was conceived as a bold step forward, a modern sports car for a new decade, but when it finally appeared in 1975, it was greeted with disappointment and derision, with its controversial styling alienating traditionalists, while indifferent build quality, erratic electrics, and unreliable mechanical components left buyers frustrated, and although some 112,000 examples were built between 1975 and 1981, the TR7 never achieved the affection or respect bestowed upon its predecessors. To make matters worse, the decade was scarred by crippling labor disputes, with production being repeatedly halted, supply chains disrupted, and quality control collapsing, with cars leaving the factory with missing parts, ill-fitting panels, and a reputation for unreliability that proved impossible to shake, with American dealers, once the lifeblood of Britain's export trade, growing weary of dealing with angry customers and endless warranty claims. This was reflected in the sales figures of the period, with the MGB, which had once sold over 500,000 units and stood as a byword for accessible motoring pleasure, seeing its annual exports to the United States collapse from more than 30,000 in 1970 to a mere trickle by the end of the decade, while Triumph's TR6, a stalwart of the 1960s and early 70s, with nearly 94,000 examples shipped overseas, could not be replaced effectively. The TR7 and its V8-powered sibling, the TR8, struggled to gain traction even at home, their reputation tarnished by years of poor workmanship and tepid performance, while by contrast, Japanese manufacturers such as Datsun and Mazda offered cars that were faster, more reliable, and better equipped, with the Datsun 240Z in particular delivering the kind of excitement and dependability that British makers could no longer guarantee. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 dealt further blows to an already beleaguered industry, as with fuel prices soaring and insurance premiums for performance cars rising sharply, consumers turned their back on indulgent sports cars, favoring instead the new generation of practical hatchbacks and fuel-efficient saloons, while even in the United States, long the natural habitat of the open-top roadster, government safety concerns led to temporary restrictions on convertible sales. Even Jaguar was not immune to the malaise, with the E-Type being retired in 1975 in favor of the XJS, which, while a more sophisticated Grand Tourer aimed at a wealthier clientele, never captured the same sense of romance or excitement, with its move from raw sports car to refined luxury machine, epitomizing the broader shift within British motoring, retreating from the purity of driving pleasure towards an uncertain pursuit of modernity and survival. By 1981, the once great British sports car industry that had dominated the world stage for 3 glorious decades lay in tatters, with factories being shuttered, workers laid off, and entire marques reduced to historical footnotes, with Triumph being discontinued entirely on cars following the end of the Honda-based Acclaim family saloon. MG lost its spiritual home of Abington and was transferred onto tuned versions of British Leyland's family saloons and hatchbacks, while the likes of Riley and Austin-Healey had long since been consigned to history. Going into the 1980s, only a handful of small independent firms such as Morgan and Lotus managed to endure, catering to enthusiasts who still valued the analog simplicity and tactile engagement of traditional motoring. But even these two companies struggled throughout the decade, with Lotus being juggled from owner to owner amid scandal surrounding its involvement with DeLorean, and Morgan being simply a brand for those in the know, appreciated by a niche group of drivers but with little in the way of widespread appeal. However, the traditional British sports car would return in a far different manner at the end of the 1980s, and from an unexpected place, as during the heyday of their original production run, Japan had been a major buyer of nippy British sports cars like the MGB and the Midget, the Triumph Spitfire and the Austin-Healey Sprite, with vast quantities either exported new or imported from Britain or the United States after their assembly runs ended. Such was the affection of Japanese drivers towards the British sports car that Mazda, known more for affordable saloons and hatchbacks, answered the call with the MX-5 of 1989, a car that would become the world's best-selling roadster with over 1 million produced, and was conceived explicitly as a tribute to the MGs, Triumphs and Lotuses of the 1960s, with its engineers studying those cars in detail, seeking to capture their spirit of mechanical purity and connection between driver and machine. The MX-5, known in the United States as the Miata, would immediately become a smash hit across the globe, and from there the roadster trend that had defined the 1950s and 60s would start all over again, as various imitators and facsimiles rose up to meet it, including the Honda S2000, the Lotus Elan M100, the MGR V8 and later MGF, the obscure BMW Z1 and later Z3, and the Audi TT. All machines that followed the same basic formula, but modified the design to be more reliable and practical than their analog predecessors, so as to improve their livability and thus make them more appealing to the mass market. However, the concept of the affordable roadster appears to be facing another downturn as per the 1970s, as while many of the early variants, such as the Lotus Elan, MGF and Honda S2000, were squeezed out of the market by the 2010s, longer-lasting survivors are now also finding themselves being removed from circulation, with the Audi TT having been discontinued in 2023 and the BMW Z4 due for withdrawal in 2026. Much like how hot hatchbacks, as the new trendsetter in the 1970s, in combination with a tightening market and increasing production costs, brought about the destruction of the original run of traditional sports cars, the new focus on electric vehicles, as well as an industry once again seeking to streamline and modernize operations so as to maximize profits as new car prices continue to rise, means luxuries such as open-top sports cars are once again destined to be the first to fall by the wayside. With that, the Mazda MX-5 is now in a position similar to that of the MGB, but even with a new price tag of $30,000 that has pushed the car somewhat out of the affordable reach for which it had become renowned, the MX-5 remains a healthy seller on the global market, both in brand new models and coveted second-hand examples. Therefore, while the golden age of the British sports car may have passed, its legacy remains woven into the fabric of global motoring culture. And from Abingdon and Coventry to California, Tokyo and beyond, the vision of a lightweight, open-top car built for the sheer joy of driving continues to inspire new generations. And even as new technologies redefine what a car can be, the essence of those simple, joyous machines of the 1950s and 60s endures, with Britain, long after surrendering its industrial empire, continuing to rule not through power or volume, but through passion, artistry, and the eternal allure of the sports car.